At the end of every interview, an employer will say to you, and do you have any questions for me? And what you really want to be prepared. Or how can you ask good questions in an interview? How can you be ready for that? So in advance, when you're determining the questions that you might be asking of an interviewer, the first thing that you need to think a little bit about is who is conducting the interview. Is the interview being conducted by someone in human resources? Is the interview being conducted by the person who would be your supervisor in your new role? Is it someone who could perhaps be a peer in your new role? And so you want to make sure that the questions that you're asking make sense given the person that's interviewing you. And this can change at various stages in the interview process. Where are you in the interview process, right? Is this your first interview? Is this your second? Is this your third? That will also determine the types of questions that you might ask. If it's your second or third interview, you're certainly going to be thinking a little bit about building on the other interviews in determining what your questions are. A lot of students ask me, well, what should I ask at the end of the interview? And the first thing that I always say is, what is it you actually want to know? What is it that you want to learn? You don't really want to ask questions just for the sake of asking questions. If you're going to ask a question, you might as well have it be about something that you think is interesting to you. What is it you would like to know? What do you want the employer to learn about you? And that can really help in how you might frame your questions. The general categories of questions, broke these into 4 different categories. Specifics about the job, about expectations that they might have for you as a new employee, information about the organization, the company that you're interviewing for, culture and fit, right? Trying to figure out a little bit more about what's it like here every day and posing questions that might help you determine, is this a place I'm interested in working? Is this a place where I might fit? And then the hiring process and the timeline, which is really important. You really want to do your homework ahead of time. Please do not ask a question that you could easily find the answer to yourself. And so you really want to familiarize yourself with their website, familiarize yourself with things that you could easily identify on your own. You don't want to be caught flat-footed when you ask a question and they think, I really think you could have found that answer on your own. So here are some sample questions in some of the categories that I've thought about. Good questions that are really open-ended and allow the employer that's interviewing you to really give you some of their perspective, some of their insight, maybe some of their personal experience. About the job, what does success look like in this position and how do you measure it? Trying to figure out what are some of the key points that you think they will be looking for in a new employee and how will they measure it? How will they evaluate that? What do you see as some of the most challenging aspects of the role? This could certainly lead to a conversation about their own personal experiences, challenges that they've faced in the past. About the organization, what are the company's values and what characteristics do you look for in employees to represent these values? So if you were to look at an employer's website, very often they might tell you what their values are, right? Like some of their corporate tenets, a mission statement, that sort of thing. So, you don't want to say, well, what's your mission statement if you can find out what it is? But when you ask something about, well, what are some characteristics that you look for in employees to represent this mission statement? That's a really good question that shows you've done your homework ahead of time and you're going to learn something a little bit about what they're really placing importance on in the workplace. What are the greatest opportunities facing the organization, the biggest challenge? That can really be a great open-ended question that could lead to some discussion as well. And then culture and fit is really you trying to figure out, what's it like here every day? What would it be like to work here? I think what's your favorite part about working here is a great question that you certainly can't find the answer to yourself. It really gives an employer an opportunity to tell you about what it is that they like about working there and give you some insight into what it might be like if you were there. Professional development is always a great question. Finding out a little bit about opportunities for professional development and what do these look like. So again, a way that you wouldn't want to ask this question would be, let's say that you want to go get another master's degree and you're wondering if they pay for that. A lot of employers might provide that information on their website, but you might not say, would you pay for me to go back and get a master's degree? But saying, what opportunities are there for professional development and what do those look like? That might be an opportunity for them to talk about that. So these are some of the sample questions that you might think about. What's nice about these types of questions too is that you could ask them of multiple people. So if you're having an interview process that's 2 rounds or 3 rounds, you could reuse some of these questions because it's based on the perspective of the person that you're speaking to. And so that can actually be helpful sometimes too to compare in your own mind, how have different people responded to the questions. How do you create a list ahead of time? Write down all of your questions. I'm saying 10 to 15, which is a little bit of a random number. You will never get to ask 10 to 15 questions in an interview. I would say usually you might get an opportunity for maybe 2 to 3, depending on how much time you have. So you won't have time for all of them, and some of them might be answered before you ask them. I know in my own experiences interviewing for my job at Penn, for other jobs, I had a long list of questions. And when they would ask at the end, do you have any questions? Often when I would go through my questions, some of the questions that I had prepared had actually been answered as a part of the interview, either because the person presented some information up front, which answered some of my questions, or through our discussion as part of the interview and questions, some of my questions got answered. And what you might want to do if you have 10 to 15 questions is break them into priority level, right? So you may have your top 3 that you really want to make sure that you're asking. But if someone says, tell me a little bit about some of the questions that you have, it's perfectly fine to look away and have a piece of paper that you're referring to go over those questions. Listen really well throughout the interview and leave room for questions that you might not have thought of based on the conversation. So perhaps based on some of the questions that you're being asked, some of the conversation, a new question pops up. You really want to be listening throughout that to think a little bit about, is there a new question that you might not have thought of? Questions not to ask. Generally speaking, anything related to salary and benefits, you really want to wait until an offer to get into those types of discussions. Something like, who is your competition? It's a little bit of a question that you can probably find the answer to yourself. Can I leave early or leave late if I get my hours in? It's a little bit of a self-serving question. I think that sometimes you can, maybe if you're trying to get them to answer that question, ask it in a different way, right? So again, speaking a little bit about what is it that you like about working here? Can you tell me a little bit about your day-to-day schedule? Can you tell me a little bit about your week-long schedule? And you never want to say no when asked if you have questions. I think so many candidates are tired at the end of an interview, and I can absolutely understand that. But I think when an employer gives you the opportunity to ask questions and you don't take it, or if you say, oh, well, they were all answered in my previous interviews, it makes it seem like you're not as interested. It makes it seem like you haven't done your homework. You never want to say no when asked if you have questions. What do you want an interviewer to learn about you? I tell all students that I meet with, not all interviewers are the greatest interviewers in the world. And sometimes they don't ask great questions. And sometimes they don't ask the questions that you wish that they would. So you really want to think a little bit about 3 things that you want them to learn about you. And how is it that you can frame your questions to give them a little bit of insight into you? So prefacing each question with what you already know. Let's say that you had conducted an informational interview with an alum earlier. You might say to them, and maybe it was someone that you met through a club that you participated in at Penn, and you could say, oh, well, I was very involved in this student group at Penn, and through some of my work there, I was connected with an alum who works at your organization. And we talked about this, and so I have another question based on that. So now you've had the opportunity to tell them a little bit that you've been involved in this organization that maybe they didn't ask you about, and that you connected with an alum, and that you're building on that. So this is a way for you to kind of maybe get in some things about yourself that they are not explicitly asking you about. So the best last question is, can you let me know the next step in the process and your timeline? Interviewing is really tiring, and I can't tell you how many students I meet with who had an interview that they thought went really well, and they're really excited about it. And now they're coming into career services and they're saying, but it's been 10 days and I haven't heard from them yet. I say, well, when did they say they'd get back to you? Oh, I didn't ask. So a really good interviewer will provide this information to you. Sometimes at the start of the interview or at the end, they'll say, okay, so, this is our first interview today. We're interviewing other candidates. We're looking to make some decisions by the end of next week. Then there'll be a second round of interviews. So when you walk away from an interview, you really want to be aware of, is this it? Is an offer coming after this? Or are there going to be additional interviews? And you really also want to know when they might be getting back to you. And the reason that you want to know when they might be getting back to you is really twofold. One is for your own mental health. I've had interviews in my career in which someone said, well, we have this big decision maker who's actually traveling for work and they're not going to be back for 3 weeks, so we won't be getting back to you for 3 weeks. So if you know that ahead of time, then in that interim 3-week period, you're not getting increasingly anxious thinking, well, it looks like they're not interested, they're not getting back to me, because they've already presented that time frame to you. Knowing the time frame also helps you to decide when it's fair to follow up. So if you have an interview on a Wednesday and they say we're going to get back to you by Friday, you don't hear from them and it's now the following Wednesday, now they're a couple days beyond what they had initially said. It's now fair to send an email a week later and say, hi, I just want to reiterate my interest, check in on where you are in the process, because you knew what the time frame was. Whereas if they have no plans to get back to you for 3 weeks and you don't know that, and then you inquire a week later, now you're a little bit off in getting in touch with them. So I always think if they don't provide the information to you, at the end of the interview, you just have to say, thank you so much. I really appreciated this opportunity today. Can you let me know the next step in the process? And can you let me know what your timeline is? The best last question. It's also a really easy one to ask. These are a couple of resources that I think are really helpful. So our Canvas interviewing course is a course that will walk you through the stages of interviewing, and there is a module in there about questions that you can ask. Our interviewing guide for graduate students and postdocs really goes through the end of the interview and what types of questions you might be able to ask. Our complete interview resource page is very helpful. And again, schedule an appointment for 30-minute career advising. We can definitely help you to craft what types of questions you want to ask.